Welcome everyone to this virtual Scholars Day presentation. Just a little housekeeping, please make sure your microphone and video are muted and your computer sound is turned on. The Carl Goodson Honors Program hosts OBU's annual Scholars Day and is sponsored by OBU's Alpha Tau Student Honors Organization. Scholars Day focuses on the academic achievements accomplished throughout the school year by students from various disciplines. The presentations and papers are digitally archived on OBU's Scholarly Commons. Today's presentation is by Maggie Donnell, a senior with double majors in study of social justice and psychology. She will be graduating summa cum laude and with honors this May. Afterwards, she will be attending the University of Arkansas School of Law in the fall to pursue a career in child and family advocacy. All right, Maggie, are you ready for the presentation?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
All right.
We'll get this pulled up. Here we go. Okay. So, hi everybody. I want to welcome you to my presentation. Today we will be looking at the United States Child Protection System, particularly its history, looking at its creation and development, the need that it has fulfilled, but also certain vulnerable populations that might have been adversely affected due to its creation, and then current ways that we can reform our system. I do want to mention that some of the subject matter might be sensitive, just to put that out there. So I want to begin with a story, one that I find just deeply ingrained in who I am today. So the setting is in 1998 with a young woman by the name of Catherine. And due to a series of events, she found herself in a situation she probably never anticipated. She was pregnant, she was in college, and she really had three options. She could terminate her baby and sort of leave that as a what might have been. She could carry the baby to term, or she could place the baby up for adoption, providing life both for her and for the baby. And so within 24 hours old, this young girl was adopted, and she was given the greatest luxuries any child could imagine. She had food on the table and clothes on her back and a roof over her head, and just the unconditional love and support of parents who she knew were always going to be in her corner. And growing up, there was never a doubt that she was loved and that she was protected and that she was cared for. And that story is my story. I can sit here today and tell you that with confidence, that is very much the fiber of who I am. And I'm very thankful that my story was not one written in pain or suffering and trauma. I'm very fortunate that that isn't my story. But while I can share the label of adopted with 7 million other individuals in the United States, what I can't share is the experience of 428,000 children in foster care every year. These children have found themselves there because they have fallen victim of maltreatment. And in 78% of the cases, it was determined that the perpetrator was the parent of that child. And while these children experience traumatizing maltreatment, a further compounding issue can be when they enter the system and the trauma that can come with that as well. As I previously mentioned, the United States child welfare system has met a great need in its creation and in its development. But often what was created to help has potentially caused harm on the very individuals it was created to serve. And so throughout this presentation, I think it's important that we look at an overview of the United States Child Protection System, both its creation and its development, and also just understanding how it functions in our nation today. I'd then like to touch on the vulnerable populations in regards to child protective services, and then mention a few of the avenues of reformation that we either have been exploring or areas that maybe we haven't considered that we should be. And so looking at the United States, E.B. Myers in the first chapter of his book really identified three main eras of it. The first being colonial times to 1875, which was characterized by the lack of organized child protection services. Before 1895, we see records of judges and magistrates acting on the behalf of maltreated children, but there wasn't a single definitive organization designed to aid children who had been abused, abandoned, or neglected. And it was in 1875 that New York City, created by two men who were just confused and frustrated that there was nothing set to help these children, organized the first society for the treatment of abused and neglected children. And so that was really the start of this second era of child protection in the United States. We see the creation and growth of these privatized services that are non-governmental, often nonprofit, that relied greatly on donations and really just the support of communities. But again, since this was a new idea that children were abused and neglected and that was a personal responsibility that needed to be taken care of, it very much was just those interested in it. But the actual spur and interest in abuse and neglect of children came from the medical field, actually, by Dr. Robert Kemp. He produced in 1962 this work that identified something known as the battered child syndrome, which first began reflecting on sexual abuse. So within the second year, people had begun to talk about physical abuse and maltreatment and neglect, but they didn't really understand the various areas that abuse can encompass. And so from 1962 to the system we see today, that's when we really see the federal government and the local and state governments step into their role of providing and monitoring these child protective services. And so when we look at our system today, I'm not sure if you can completely read the chart on the right, but that's just an extensive sort of flow when a child enters the child welfare system. But just a little brief overview of it. A call is often made to the child abuse hotline when there's suspicion of abuse, abandonment, and neglect of a child. From there, the designated state or local child welfare agency decides whether to accept and investigate the allegation. In some cases, it is found to be insufficient, and so the case is dropped. But if there is an investigation and it's followed through, they can see either A, that this child was indeed abused, but they don't necessarily have to be taken out of the home. And so in those instances, the child does remain in the house and different resources are provided to improve the family situation. If the home environment is deemed unsafe, that is when the child is then removed and placed in temporary out-of-home placements, including foster care, at-home facilities, and adoption even. And so in some cases, there can be a change in parental and legal authority, and that's when we see these instances of state guardianship and adoption, with the defining feature between those two being the termination of parental rights in adoption. And so when we look at child protection today, it's important to understand how children get involved in this system. Today, there's really four main forms of child maltreatment that we see. And I particularly want to call your attention to the neglect and the psychological maltreatment. Neglect is the most common form of child maltreatment, and it's believed that 75% of the cases brought to the hotline are cases of neglect. And I also want to make note about the psychological maltreatment. This is the most difficult abuse to charge on because it's often believed to be this internalized abuse. And so since it's not readily seen, it's more difficult to identify that as the abuse a child has experienced. But in the fiscal year 2010, that was the following breakdown of maltreatment that was observed. And again, I want to call your attention that according to DHS, they do define a difference between neglect and the medical neglect of a child. And so with our current state of United States child protection, it's important to understand the division of responsibility. Who is the one orchestrating this massive system? And so the responsibility really falls on all three levels of organization: the federal government, the state governments, and the local governments. I particularly highlighted the federal and state governments specifically because those are the two that have greater control and authority. They're the ones who are enacting legislation, they're financing, they're monitoring, and they're assessing. But it's really the local level where we see the resources and the investigations taking place. The division of responsibility is important to understand because when there's three different levels involved, it almost guarantees that no one branch is going to become burdened by the situation, but it also blurs the line when problems do arise, because if there's three entities involved in child protection, it's difficult to be able to pinpoint where a problem originated when there's three different distinctive but intertwined agencies working together. And so before we move on to look at these vulnerable populations that might have slipped through the cracks, I do want to make a note that by no means am I trying to point fingers or place blame. This is just the very beginning of a very honest conversation about our system and the way, again, that it has fulfilled a great need, but has potentially harmed certain individuals. And so the first vulnerable population that I explored was race. How does race play into an individual's experience in the child welfare system? And there is a observed pattern of individuals of the African American community being overrepresented in the foster care system. In 2008, we see that the most prevalent races and ethnicities were indeed white, Black or African American, and Hispanic. But when we break those down by states and they're compared to the general population, we can readily see overrepresentation and underrepresentation. But again, on the surface, that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. And so in my thesis, I really did a brief case study over three of our nation's four most populous states: California, Texas, and New York. In California, it was observed that white and Latino children are underrepresented, yet Black children are 4 times what would be expected. Just as is with the nation as a whole, when you look at the numbers of children involved in the child welfare system, Black and white children are equal, representing about 24 and 25% respectively, and the Latino population are those combined and doubled. But when the Department of Finance in California looked at the actual population of this state, they determined that 27% of the state's population was white, 6% was Black, and 51% was Latino. And so when you compare the rates of foster care to the actual demographic composition of the state, we see that, again, that Hispanic and white children are slightly underrepresented, but the Black community is overrepresented in the child welfare system. A very similar pattern was also observed in Texas with a case study that was conducted there. That research observed that the mean predicted probability of foster care placement was 2.5 percentage points higher for Black children relative to white, and there was no statistical significance between the probability of a placement for a Latino child and a white one. And then we also observed New York, which it's almost ironic that it finds itself here because this was the first state that began to take notice and action in regards to child welfare. But it has been observed that they've been in this epic struggle since about the 1960s to reform their own system. But in particular, in these recent years, we've begun to see what's been noted as a troubling and long-standing phenomenon known as Jane Crow. And so in New York, there's the Administration for Children's Services. And in recent years, there's begun to see this increase where the administration has been taking children on the grounds that their safety is at risk when there's scant evidence to prove that. Indeed, between 2016 and 2017, there was a 40% increase in requests for removals in family court. I couldn't find exactly why that might be, but lawyers who were working on these cases and on behalf of these individuals so that often their clients had few resources and that they were predominantly poor and of Black and Hispanic origin. And so this idea of Jane Crow, specifically the criminalization of this specific population's parenting practices. And so again, when we see various states, it always seems to come that the African American community, for some reason, is overrepresented in the child protective system. The next group or population that I wanted to observe was that of the aged out youth. And while it's known as many different names, youth in transition, transition age youth, it is always referring to those individuals for whom the government is no longer mandated to provide services. If you'll recall from what I said earlier of the division of responsibility, child welfare is also predominantly run at the state level. And so that age of aging out really depends by state, but it's often 18 to 21. And these are just a few of the statistics that we see of individuals who've aged out of the foster care system and their outcomes once they do. It is expected that each year, 25% of the children will age out of the child welfare system, which is about 5% of the overall population. And when we hear that, we think, oh, it's just 5%. That really can't be that many. But when we think about the price that taxpayers are paying for these children, we see that it is nearly $8 billion per annual wave of children that are aging out, whether that's due to their homelessness, the unemployment rates that we see. So not only is this coming at an emotional price for these children, to lose that security and the stability that many of them have known throughout their childhood, we also see a great financial burden that this has on our country. And the final vulnerable population that I mentioned in my thesis was that of young mothers. It has been observed that there is an intergenerational component to foster care, that if a mother has been or is involved in the system, there's an increased likelihood that their child will also find themselves in the system. There was a study done in Manitoba, Canada, that found that half of the children born to teen mothers in foster care will also enter the foster care system by their second birthday. And those are just the breakdown of statistics within those 2 years. But when we compare that to the rate for out-of-care mothers, we see that by the second birthday, out-of-care mothers only see a 10% likelihood of having their children taken from them. And so there's this big discrepancy between those involved and those who are not. That same study also found that children who spend time in the care of child protection services also have higher rates of adolescent pregnancy. So not only do we see this increased likelihood of becoming pregnant, we see an increased likelihood that that child is going to stay too. And so when you look at that statistic that young women in foster care are twice as likely, again, that doesn't seem very high, and we might be tempted to say, well, that's in Canada, that's not us. But when we keep that in mind, we know that the United States rate of teenage pregnancy is over half that of Canada's. And if that number is as high as it is there, you can only imagine what that might mean for us. I do want to make an important note here that President Donald Trump in 2018 has actually taken steps to provide for these children and their families by signing in February the Family First Prevention Services Act, which ensures that within the first year of life that these young mothers are receiving the resources that they need to ensure that they can keep their child. And so when you look at these vulnerable populations and you look at their experiences, it compels you to want to see this reform of our system. And sometimes you're inclined to think, well, we just need to transform it, but that's a big overhaul. And so it's important to understand the ways that we can actually and feasibly reform our system. The first is this sort of big picture. We can look at legislative action on the part of the federal government. As I previously mentioned, we have actually taken steps to do that. Within our history of the United States child welfare system, we see the development of different agencies and departments devoted strictly to the well-being and welfare of children and their families. And then we also have that Family First Prevention Services Act, which I mentioned. But then we can also look at the actual institution of child welfare, and we can look at the managers, the supervisors, and the caseworkers who are really the hands and feet of the system. In New Zealand, actually, we see that they did take on the challenge of reforming their institution of child welfare. And it was really in the 1990s due to this increasing pressure to see change in effectiveness and efficiency. And so the defining feature of their reform was a managerial discipline and professional leadership, which ultimately allowed for this development of professional reforms of the system. I wasn't able to find statistics on the success of that, but if that ultimately did become a successful program to implement, that's certainly something I think we should consider as a nation as well. We can also see reformation within the actual strategies and practices of the system, which has especially been found effective when we combine resources for preventative services as well as kinship care. And when we look specifically at preventative services, we do see that there's an increase in spending on the forefront, but ultimately there is a long-term gain in investing in these services. It is believed that when we do, there's a reduction of lifetime costs of 3 to 7%, which averages about 5.2 to 10.3 billion dollars. But then when we also look at kinship care, that it's not just about these services on the forefront, but it's actually keeping these children within the family unit. That might not necessarily mean with the perpetrator, but somebody still related to the child and around them. As according to this study, it was found that when children are placed in kinship care, that there's a 4% fewer likelihood of episodes occurring, and there was a 6% decrease in homelessness, underemployment, convictions, and substance abuse once these children continue to age. And so we see that when these two are combined, there's great success, not only for these children, but also added benefits for our nation as a whole. And the final reform that I proposed wasn't necessarily a reform, but it was more of a recommendation as we're considering reformation, and that is perspective taking. Oftentimes, those that do have the authority and the ability to enact changes and even just the functioning of our child protective services have not experienced it for themselves. And so you see this disconnect between the experience of these individuals and the certain policies and practices that are being imposed on them. And so I think it's important to consider those perspectives of the system involved parents and guardians, because I really do think they have a greater insight into what it's actually like on the ground within the system. And so throughout this presentation, really my thesis, the main sort of argument that I proposed was when looking at an overview of the history of the United States protection system, we do see tremendous progress, and that does not need to go understated or overlooked. We have made tremendous progress in the few hundred years we've been enacting it. But when we look at statistics, they show serious concerns to the adequacy of our current system, and that our current system can actually cause harm to certain vulnerable populations, certain racial groups, young mothers, and even those that have aged out of the system. And so the child protective system in the United States needs radical reformation, and we see avenues at different levels that we can actively enact, because not only does the welfare of our children depend on it, but so does the future of our nation. If we're not investing in our future generations, we are setting ourselves up for failure in the future. And this is most certainly a way, as it's their development, that these children can ensure that our future as well is secure. And so I just really want to thank you all for taking time on your Saturday to hear something that is so important to me. It really has been a joy. It's been a struggle to find the motivation to write and to research, especially a topic that is heavy and it's difficult. And again, nobody wants to point fingers and say, oh, well, it's all wrong, because it is right in many ways. But I really do appreciate you all just taking the time to come and join me in this conversation. And just, again, understanding that by no means is this the end of it. It's just simply the beginning of a long conversation of assessing and reassessing how we're doing and taking care of our most vulnerable in our country. So.
Does anybody have any questions for Maggie?
Hey Maggie, this is Krista. You did a wonderful job. I had a quick clarification. I was very interested. You were talking about the African American population having a higher rate of involvement in the system, and I wanted to ask if what you meant by that was a higher rate of reports of abuse and maltreatment, or a higher rate of African American kiddos and families actually, like the kids being taken into foster care, because locally here it seems to be opposite of what we're seeing is what you were saying. So just a little clarification.
Yes, according to the statistics that I found, that was actual children that had been taken into the system. So not just the reports, but they had been removed from the home and placed into the foster care system.
Awesome, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Krista.
Hey Maggie, this is Steve and Stephanie.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are y'all?
We're doing great.
You did awesome.
Yes,
Thank
you did. Enjoyed it. Hey, I got just a quick question. When you were comparing the teenage pregnancy rates of the U.S. and Canada, were you saying that in the U.S. it's twice
Yes.
as much as it is in Canada?
Yes, sir. So the rate of teen pregnancy that we see in the United States is double the rate of Canada's teenage pregnancy.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Maggie, I have a question. You listed 4 areas in which a reformation can begin to take place. Where would you recommend that such a reformation should start? Should it start with legislation? Should it start with management? Where would you recommend a start to actually take place?
No, I think that is a really great question. And it's one that I really don't believe I have a great answer to just yet, even after all of this research. Because a part of me is inclined to believe that it's really that federal level that we can see with the inaction of legislation and the resources funneled towards these services and these the actual system as a whole. But I think ultimately it is a personal responsibility, both in, I think even something that I didn't mention in taking that personal responsibility to report it when we see it, to take an interest in these populations. And so I don't know, it's very difficult because I see the resources available as you become higher up in these levels, but I think also it's on us as well to take an interest and to educate ourselves and others on the implications of our system and its functioning.
Thank you.
Hi, Maggie. This is Terry Johnson, and this was a lot of very good information, and it gives you a lot to think about. I was not aware of a lot of stuff in the very beginning that made me think, and something I wanted to ask you was that did you read or find any studies comparing that when children stay more consistent within the same foster home, if they have more success than those children that seem to jump from foster home to foster home? Because I've often seen through some of my experience in working with children that was a real hard experience for children in ever getting past that point where they didn't go through the same situation that the young mother went through, if they had some consistency. Were there any studies done to kind of compare if they had any more success, if they had more consistency staying with a family than moving so much?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. And I'm not necessarily, I don't believe I came into any resources that stated the rate at which they stay with the families. But one of the 3 main goals of child welfare is for a children's security, for a children's safety, and for permanency. And so there were studies published that I came across that said that two of the most detrimental factors is the amount of time that a child finds themselves in the system and the amount of placements that they have. And so an increase in time and an increase in placement does lead to an increased likelihood of undesirable outcomes.
Okay. I know just with working with children, regardless of what children have gone through or who they've been with, they'll still tell you they want to be with their parents. They'll still want to be with their mom. And it's quite a situation that they go through, but every time they would hop from one home to another, it seemed like that was just so detrimental to them.
Absolutely. Yes, thank you for sharing that. Absolutely.
Hey, Maggie, this is Dr. Franklin.
Hi, Dr. Franklin.
Well done. I want to commend you. You structured your argument in a really effective and clear and powerful way. And not only that, you emphasized why this issue is so important, and I really want to commend you for that. I also want to ask you a question. You had made a statement about the criminalization of African American parenting practices. Do you happen to know specifically what practices those might be?
Sure. So the resource that I actually took that statement from was one that I was introduced to when I was interning in Chicago. That was sort of my opening into, hey, here's the job you're doing. And in that article, it tracks 3 different mothers in New York City. And one of them shared her story of how her child became involved in the system. And it's not necessarily their parenting practices, but it's often situations that could happen to anybody, but because of their race, it was judged that they were incompetent to parent. And so one of the mothers in that story, her child had gone to the park and was playing across the street. She could see them from her window. All was fine, but the child fell. And so the mother rushed, picked up her child, took them to the ER, and the child had other cuts and bruises that just come with childhood. And the emergency room specialists were concerned that there was abuse taking place. And so when they made the call, they found things on in the home, such as dirty dishes. And she lived in a lower income community of New York City. And they determined that this situation was harmful and that she had punished her child when you look at the story, the child was just playing outside. But we see other cases where if that were to happen in another community of a different socioeconomic status, or if the mother had been a different race, that the outcome would have looked much different.
I see. Thank you.
Any other questions for Maggie? Wonderful job, Maggie. Thank you. I know I learned so much information about the foster care system and its needs. Thank you all for watching this wonderful presentation. You can view other presentations from our virtual Scholars Day and previous Scholars Day from our Scholarly Commons website, which is scholarlycommons.obu.edu. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Great job, Maggie.
Thank you.
Good job, Maggie. It's great work.
Outstanding.
Thank
Good job.
you.